Hey, gentlemen, this is Vince Miller. Thank you so much for joining me for this devotional. We are in the book of Galatians. So excited to have you along for this journey. Today, we're in chapter 1. I'm going to read verses 6 through 7. Listen to Paul as he says, I'm astonished, I am shocked, I am surprised, I am taken back that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. So before we dig into this text, I want to note 4 details about the letter to the Galatians that I think will help give you some context. First, it was one of the first letters of the New Testament, written even before the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Second, it's also the first of Paul's letters, and many of you know that he wrote about 13 in the New Testament. This was the first one he ever wrote. Third, it's a letter that's circulated to 3 different churches, not just to one church. He's not just writing to one, he's writing to 3. These are churches that he visited on his first missionary trip. They're the towns of Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. And fourth, and I think most notable here, Paul seems a little ticked off. He seems irritated. And I think I know why he was so irritated. I think he's irritated because he used to be a legalist. You see, before Paul or Saul met Jesus, he studied legalism, he practiced legalism, and he enforced legalism, down to the letter of the law. I mean, he was a Pharisee of Pharisees, he says, but when Saul met Jesus on that Damascus Road, Jesus confronted his legalism. You remember that moment on the Damascus Road when he's heading down with his legalistic notebook to confront Christians? Well, Jesus confronts him. He's confronted by the grace of God, literally God's grace, risen and visible to him, and Jesus confronts his legalistic righteousness. And right at that moment, Paul has to come to terms with the fact that God's grace outmatched his legalistic religious behavior. It was something that God extended to him. Grace was something extended to Saul in the life, death, and resurrection that he was face to face with in Jesus. And guess what? This grace gave Paul a brand new sight. And I think here in this context, Paul has a right to be irritated because religious legalism is nothing like the message of the good news of grace. Legalism, in fact, has a 4-fold effect on the good news, a negative effect. First, it encourages impossible standards that no one can live up to, not even you or I. Second, it promotes self-righteousness and all the self-centered motivations that go along with it. Third, it fosters division in the church and between people and classes and different giftings. And fourth, and I think most heinous of all, it downgrades the righteousness of Jesus and everything he has done, accomplished, and completed for us. Thus, it's a 4-fold nullification of the gospel. And Paul says that legalism isn't a gospel. It isn't a gospel. It may look like the gospel, but it ain't no gospel at all. That's a really bad rendition of the book of Galatians. So, fellas, we have to stand up for the good news of the gospel of grace. That's our job. And we stand up by standing against the legalism that actually persuades our hearts. But what does it look like to do something like that? How do we stand against legalism? Well, here's what it looks like. At the moment, you feel maybe far or distant from God or Jesus because you've been disobedient. To stand against it, all you need to do is preach to yourself his gospel of grace. In those moments you feel the most sinful, just preach back to it a gospel of grace. And also, at the moment you feel close to Jesus because of your obedience, you also need to preach to yourself his gospel of grace, which you can't earn and you don't deserve. And this isn't some strange self-help positive talk strategy. It's not that at all. This is speaking the message of truth back to the heinous, devious, and insidious sin that lies within each one of us. It's to speak back to the enemy of legalism. And we're going to have to preach this to ourselves for the rest of our living lives, living obediently in the gospel of grace every single day. So fellas, where do you need to preach the gospel of grace to yourself today? Is it to an act of obedience or to an act of disobedience? And then preach it to yourself. And let's stand against the fake gospel of legalism. Man, heavy I know, but I love you guys. I pray this blesses you, helps you to live in a little bit more freedom today. And with that, I'll see you right back here again tomorrow.